Today's topic is anatomy of a mishap, and a very interesting discussion with an old friend of HAI. I'd like to get right into the introductions. Our first person speaking today will be Jim Viola, the president and CEO of HAI. And our presenter today is Stan Rose, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the Helicopter Safety Alliance and is a past employee of HAI. He has also been very active on safety boards and safety groups all around the United States, has a lot of experience. As always, we invite you to ask questions during the webinar. To do so, there is a question module in the control panel on the side of your screen. All you need to do is type in your question, we will receive it, and we will do our best to get your question answered towards the end of the webinar when Stan takes questions. This webinar is being recorded. The link will be provided to everybody who is watching today. We will also have it posted on our website. If people miss it, if you want to share it, just look for that link. And now I'd like to introduce Jim Viola, President and CEO of HAI.
All right. Well, good morning, good afternoon. I know we've got another bunch of countries going on again, so I appreciate the good attendance that we're getting at these webinars. And like we've done in past webinars, today I want to take a look at the cause of a mishap or an accident. You know, there's an old quote that those who fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it. So while it's true in many things, it really makes sense in aviation. By looking backwards into the scene of an accident, we hope to determine the cause of that event and work to make sure that we don't make the same mistakes ourselves or our friends. None of us want to experience a problem in flight, but expecting one to happen and planning strategies to solve the issue can literally make the difference between life and death. So proper response requires that you already need to know what to do when that happens. And that's the big training aspect of it all. That's one of the reasons all new pilots were taught and are taught to auto-rotate. You know, the biggest thing, or you know, when the aircraft stops flying for an engine failure, you got to know what to do and do that safe auto rotation. So learning from others is the base of mentoring. The sharing of knowledge or experience helps new pilots understand what could happen to them and how someone else has already probably developed a solution to that issue because they've been through it. So if you're a longtime member of industry, please do what you can to help the newer pilots and the maintenance personnel along with their careers. If you're comparatively new to this industry, relatively new would be probably, it never hurts to find one of us old timers, and you know, there's plenty around, and ask for advice. Most of us in the industry like to talk while flying. I certainly do, and I know Stan does as well. So I'd like at that point, you know, Stan is a longtime friend, a veteran, and a QB. And to present today's topic in his own words, Stan has learned the hard way what one needs to know to safely operate an aircraft. Stan, as mentioned, is currently the CEO of Helicopter Safety Alliance. He has 5 decades of helicopter experience, including stints as a U.S. Army pilot in Vietnam and the Army Reserves. He's also done airborne law enforcement, offshore oil, and air ambulance missions. Served on the board of the Association of Air Medical Services and on the FAA's Part 135 Pilot Rest and Duty Rules Aviation Rulemaking Committee. So Stan, bring up your camera and let you kick this off.
Well, thanks, Jim. How are you? How's everybody doing today? And this is an opportunity, you know, for, you know, I came into the safety business and have really enjoyed it, you know, but I really was introduced to the safety side of things, not from the point of view of having gone to a school and learned about safety from in the classroom. I learned about safety by making a lot of mistakes. I have to say that I came into this thing because I've done some stupid things and I've gotten away with them, you know, and frankly, it's an interesting career and I have enjoyed every minute of it. So I want to go over a couple of things, and really the point of this exercise is to talk about what can happen and what we're going to do. We're going to talk about the physics of a few things and really gain some experience and hopefully will give you something to think about ahead of time, because when an accident happens or when a mishap happens, it's not the time to be thinking about what you're going to do, right? You have to have a plan. And I got to say that I came to this. I went to flight school in the U.S. Army. I was a high school to flight school guy for Vietnam, and I was young. I was in flight school when I was 18, and there's one instructor that I will never forget. His name was CW2 Jewell. It's the only name I remember from my whole flight school experience. But CW2 Jewell was just an old, crusty veteran, and he got us as we were just getting towards the end of flight school. We were transitioning into the Hueys, getting ready to go to Vietnam, right? And he got up on the platform one day, and he was, I'm a young guy from the Northeast, in a small town near Philadelphia, and I get down there, and he is a tobacco chewing guy that says things like, "Don't you know?" And it was a cultural experience to listen to him talk, because it was a pleasure. And he got in there, he says, at some point in time, he says, you've been going through all this flight school stuff, and you've learned all the emergency procedures. You've learned the book and how to do all this stuff. But what's going to happen when you're really involved and when you really have something go wrong? For example, he said, when you're in a hot LZ in Vietnam and people are shooting at you, he says, your enemy does not know how to lead a helicopter very well, so they hit the tail boom an awful lot of the time, right? He says, you're going to lose a tail rotor sometime, and they teach you, how to do a running landing or how to kind of roll the throttle off and all those procedures. He says, this is not the place you want to end up. He says, if you can get that Huey flying, it's got a huge tail boom, and if you can get it up to 40 knots, you can fly it back somewhere safe, which is a good piece of advice, right? So but he doesn't stop there. He says, listen, you need to think ahead about these things. This thing will take a lot of abuse, but once you get it flying, there is no reason to put this aircraft down in a place that you don't want to be. He says, now think about this. If you go back to your home base, they probably have a place for you to land there, but they'll probably just give you another Huey and send you back to the war. He says it's a much better idea to go to an Air Force base where they got big runways and they got control towers, firefighting equipment. Those guys never get to fight the war. This is important. You got to be involved with everyone. So he said, take it to the Air Force base. And oh, by the way, call them with plenty of time. And because they want to get all that equipment out, and everybody's going to come out on the side of the runway and watch you crash, So pretty soon, he says, you set up all the things, and all the other aircraft have to go other places because you've declared an emergency. And he says, you get out there and you do a big shallow approach, and you bring it down the runway, and you look out there, and they have put foam down on the runway for you, and you're looking at it, and there's the foam there on the runway, and on the left, all the guys have called their buddies, and there's 4 rows of people out there with cameras waiting for you to crash. He says, that's not enough. Do a go around. Give them some time. They'll bring out, pretty soon you got 8 rows of people out there, right? And this is all just thinking ahead. And by the way, when you put it down, don't go in the foam. That stuff smells bad, right? And off on the side of the runway in front of those people, there was a fuel spill one day. And there's a piece of grass place out there where the grass doesn't grow and it's dusty. He says, slide it to a stop in the dust, right? And keep the pitch up a little bit. And when you step out of the helicopter, you pull your Australian bush hat real low across your eyes, and you put your 38 low on your hip, and step out of the helicopter, put an unlit cigarette in your mouth. Then tell the co-pilot to lower the pitch, and as the dust settles and you step out, you walk up to the highest ranking officer you can find and say, hey, buddy, you got a light? Because then they'll know you're bad, right? So the point of this is that, thinking ahead, tail rotor failures, I got to tell you, the first time it happened to me, I got over the tree line and got it over 40 knots, and my crew chief from the back said, Mr. Rose, why are you laughing? I said, we're going to have dinner at an Air Force base tonight, And so the point of this is to think about it ahead of time. What are you going to do? How do you picture these things, and how is it going to think? Another situation that you might find yourself in is double IMC, all right? And I don't know if you've thought about this, but, I went back and looked at we used to fly IFR on those UH-1s, and it's got a 6-pack in it. You can fly IFR in a VFR helicopter. Now, they're not rated for it, and they're not, but this is something you could think about ahead of time. There are a couple of things you should think about before you ever get down to the point where you're, having to go into IMC. So you've thought ahead, but if you practice, and you can practice on a laptop or desktop flight simulator, the skills that it takes to prevent vertigo, right? And I did a talk one time and I was looking up the how to induce vertigo, right? And they basically said that you change 3 parameters and then turn out the lights. You lose your vision after that, you will induce vertigo. So what do we do as pilots when the weather's getting bad? First we go down, then we slow down, and then we turn around. And frankly, that we've already set ourselves up to get vertigo, right? And if the lights go out and you pop into the clouds, now you're not only having to do a skill, which is fly the aircraft and control it and keep it right side up, but you've also given yourself vertigo before you ever get started. I want you to think about that ahead of time. So if you find yourself in a situation where you don't think you can avoid it, first look down, see if there's a place to land, but don't do 3 things. Don't change 3 parameters. Think about this ahead of time, and remember, that you're quite capable of flying IFR. Most of us, today, almost everybody who goes through flight school gets an instrument ticket, and unfortunately, we don't fly aircraft that are capable, and so it's a perishable skill. The next time you use your IFR skills is probably, when you get into an inadvertent IMC condition. And so we should think about that way ahead of time and not do it. The second thing is that you should declare the emergency, right? There is, there is always a fear, and I had this fear, right? That somebody would take away my license if I called the tower and declared the emergency and confessed to the fact that I allowed myself to get in this bad circumstance, right? But there is an actual number of violations, the number of people that the FAA has ever taken their license away for doing the right thing, which is to fly and go into the clouds, is 0. They've never taken somebody's license for doing it. As long as you declare the emergency and do it all by the book. An incident came out while I was still working for HAI where somebody was trying to do a certificate action and it got stopped. The bottom line is that you will never lose your license for not killing yourself by doing the wrong thing, right? And that's what we have to think in terms of what are we going to do? How are we going to do it? And what have we done to practice? And I got to tell you, it's a little difficult for me because I normally speak in front of live audiences, but think about this ahead of time. How many of you have done some practice, even on a flight simulator, any type of simulator, and I include, Microsoft Flight Simulator. It's a skill, and we have to practice it, and we have to have the confidence to know that we know how to do it, right? While I'm talking about that, there's a couple of things. First of all, when you call the tower, they're going to ask you to do certain things, and you also have to remember that it's within your purview to say no. If they ask you to change frequencies, just say no. I'm fighting to keep this thing right side up, and I'm not going to stick my head down to look at the numbers on a radio and try and change it. We're going to stay on this frequency. Things like that, where you protect yourself and don't let somebody else's request get you to induce vertigo on yourself. So again, these are things to keep in mind ahead of time before we get into this situation. But I actually gave this talk and I was asked by a guy in the audience if I would go out to dinner with him, right? And I said, yes. So I went out, met with him, his wife, and his daughter. And it turned out that his daughter was 15 years old and he was a flight instructor. And she had a bunch of hours. She might have had 30 or 40 hours, but she wasn't old enough to solo yet or something. But she had some time. Well, he was ferrying an R-22. And he was going, and he got himself in a situation where he was out in the middle of the mountains, and things were closing in around him. And he said, I wanted to thank you because when it was all starting to go bad, I could hear your voice, saying, don't crash, climb and confess and do all the right things, right? He flew 23 minutes of hard IFR in an R-22. Now, he did a couple of smart things. Number one, he got his daughter and he said, you look at the attitude indicator and tell me if I'm messing up, right? And number two, he was on the radio with the tower and he realized he didn't have enough fuel to make it to the airport, right? He wasn't going to get there. But he knew a friend of his lived partway there on one of those airport communities, a little grass strip where the garage is a hangar. And he called his friend and I asked him what the weather looked like. The controller talked him down to the ground on the runway, and he broke out and stayed at his friend's house that night instead of being out in the middle of the woods. He said he had almost 2 minutes of fuel left on board, and so it was a pretty bad experience, but it was really interesting to hear him talk about it, right? This is something that we can all do to help ourselves and keep ourselves oriented when the time comes, right? And it saved his life, and it was very gratifying to hear him say so. Practice, and it will help. Let's talk about engine failures. Jim brought that up. We actually have two types of engine failures, a hovering auto rotation and an in-flight auto rotation. Listen, in a hovering auto rotation, I've heard the argument where people say, well, it's not really an auto rotation. You don't enter auto rotation, you just cushion the blow and put it on the ground. One of the things to remember is that in any hovering auto rotation, the thing that's going to happen that you need to remember is its direction of travel, right? You need to work the pedals, whichever, whether you're hovering sideways or forward or backwards, get the nose pointed in the direction you're going to travel so it doesn't hit the ground moving sideways, because that's how it trips, falls over, and parts start going everywhere. So direction of travel is number one. And frankly, we ought to practice good hovering techniques ahead of time so that we're, traveling in the direction that we've got the nose pointed in that direction. So if the engine quits, you're on the ground pretty quickly. Mostly what you're going to do is cushion the blow. And this is a reflex. It's not like an in-flight auto rotation. It's going to happen. You're going to see the ground coming fast, stomp on the pedal, get it moving in the right direction, get the nose pointed in the right direction, and cushion the blow. And that's really all the time you're going to have. It's going to be over before you can make any real conscious decisions. In flight is a whole separate thing. So I want to talk a little bit about how we're going to go about that, right? What's going to happen? So first of all, you can do anything you want. You can do, have you ever heard of a falling leaf auto rotation? So you back it up and go forward and back. And the object of any auto rotation, whether you're going to do a 180, whether you're going to land straight ahead, whatever you're going to do, the object is to get to the gate. And I call this the gate is at 100 feet AGL. You've got the rotor in the green and some airspeed, right? Typically, 60 to 80 knots, something like that. But the bottom line is if you have all those things, you got your RPM, you got you're at 100 feet with airspeed, you're going to be able to accomplish a standard auto rotation. Doesn't matter what you do to get there. That might be some finagling, but the object here is to have everything set up so that the last part of the auto rotation is going to be perfectly normal. Now, the object of that is that, at the bottom, right, hopefully you've made it to a place where you can actually do a good auto rotation, clearing a thing. But that's not always true. Some of the time, it's just going to be you're at the wrong place in the wrong time when the engine quits, and there is no good place to go to. I want you to remember something really important. A good auto rotation to a bad landing area is much better than a bad auto rotation to a good landing. What I'm telling you is, don't try to stretch out the glide to make a little bit, because if you get to the end and it's a good area, but you don't have the RPM, you're not in that gate, you know, it's not going to be a good outcome when you get to the bottom. I want you to promise yourself that you're going to do a good auto rotation. That means you get to 100 feet with airspeed and a good attitude and RPM, right? And we're going to do a good auto rotation, even if it's to a bad area. So what do I mean by that? So one of the things I can tell you, if you have ever done the physics on this, think about your own aircraft. If you're in an auto rotation at 0, 0, 0 auto rotation, going straight down and in auto rotation, anybody have any idea how fast you're going? Typically, helicopters somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,800 feet a minute, you know, even if you're not doing any forward airspeed. You know, so a 0, 0 straight down auto rotation is 1,800 feet a minute, right? So if you do the math, you know, there's 60 minutes in an hour, 525 feet in a mile. When you do the math, you'll find out that 1,800 feet a minute is just over 20 miles an hour. Survivable. That's if you never pull pitch, right? And so that's, again, if we think of these things ahead of time, what kills you? In a bad auto rotation, it's forward airspeed that kills you, right? So you can go straight down and hit the ground at 20 miles an hour, and you'll probably survive, right? Same thing is true if you're landing in the rocks, if you're landing in the trees, if you're, you know, the real key is don't lose the RPM. Try to maintain that gait and do a good auto rotation. A couple other things to think about, right, is that you know, in automobile crashes, they talk about the crumple zone in the car, but that's also true of a helicopter. Let's say that you're over the national forest and you know there's nowhere to go but into the trees. Again, I say you do a good auto rotation to a bad area, but when you get to the bottom, what's the best crumple zone you've got in the helicopter? The tail boom, right? So my contention would be that if you find yourself in that circumstance and you're going to go into the trees, do a regular normal auto rotation to the treetops, and then back it in. Go in tail first. You know, we used to laugh about in Huey's. You know, they say when you crash, if you're the aircraft commander, you're sitting on the left side, so of course you roll it to the right. You know, you get to pick, so you want to make sure that your door's open when the thing's over. So which way do you roll it? And there's some interesting physics that go with that too. If the blades start hitting things, does it rip the transmission out? You know, how do we go about it? But the reality here is get the airspeed to 0, use the crumple zones, and take a good auto rotation to a bad area rather than stretch it out to the to a bad spot. All right. So the bottom line is that thinking about this ahead of time makes a big difference, right? Other situations, I was flying in Louisiana, flying for the oil companies, and I was in a Long Ranger, and frankly, they strip every piece of equipment out of it. It didn't have a heater in it. And it does get cold there in the winter sometimes. So we had a cold day, and of course, once you get out over the water, the Gulf of Mexico is relatively warm. You don't have icing problems. But we had a semi-icy day flying out of Lafayette. Again, this is a story that you know, it wasn't the best decision to go, but you know, we waited for quite a while and there was some ice, and then it cleared up and temperature went up a little bit, and so we headed down the road. And about 15 miles into the trip, all of a sudden, you know, from nowhere, the whole helicopter iced up. You know, when I finally got it to the ground, there was almost 3/4 of an inch of ice on thing, rime ice. And one of the things, the only thing I can tell you about this is that it's a horrible experience. Suddenly you can't see anymore, and the helicopter's too heavy, it won't fly anymore. And you know, luckily I kept my wits about me enough to realize that the window out my right side was just plexiglass, and so I broke it out with an elbow and was, I was Frosty the Snowman by the time I got it to the ground, but I, just got enough room to cushion it on the ground as the ice was heavy. Again, a little experience, a little bit of thinking ahead, and remember that most of the doors in your helicopter can be broken relatively easily. I want to spend some time talking about prevention. And again, this is the things that we should be thinking about in those hours and hours of boredom while we're flying. One definition of flying helicopters is hours and hours of boredom accentuated by moments of sheer terror. So there's some things that might keep you alive, and I'm just going to go over a couple of things, and hopefully this experience will give you something to think about while we're doing it. There's three things that I think in the long term that if we think about ahead of time, it will help us have a long and fruitful career, right? Number one is that you need to recognize when there's an emergency and that the emergency exists, right? We'll talk a little about that. You also need to know what to do when the emergency happens, right? And how we're going to go about that. And then understand aviation decision making, right? We get paid for flying helicopters, but what we really get paid for is to make decisions, right? And that's one of the things that we're going to have to talk about and think about ahead of time, and how we make those decisions is really important. So let's start with the first one, recognizing that there is an emergency. When the engine quits, that's easy. We know, right? You have to get the pitch down, you got to get the airspeed under control, and you got to enter auto rotation. That's an easy one. When it's a series of events, that's much harder. The series of events that happen, and if you've ever read any of the NTSB accident reports, they read like a bad horror story. It's like, all of a sudden, the things are going bad. We who are reading about this accident can see the chain of events adding up to an accident. It's a natural thing. You watch a bad horror film and they say, oh, somebody got murdered, let's split up, or don't go into the basement. But you can see these things coming. The hard part is when it's happening to us and it's a series of events, and recognizing that it's going to add up to a bad outcome, right? And that's something that we have to teach ourselves to look for, right? One of the tools that we use for that is a checklist ahead of time, or a flight risk analysis tool, FRAT tool. And the FRAT tool is not designed to help you make a decision about whether or not to go. It's to point out to you some of the things that are capable of going wrong. So if you do your FRAT and it's a marginal decision to go, if you start seeing new things happening, you should be thinking to yourself, well, this could add up to a bad outcome. And at some point, the AIs, land the helicopter. The bottom line here is that it's an appropriate thing to do to land the helicopter, do precautionary landings. And we should do that more often than I think gets done now, right? And unfortunately, some of our accidents happen because we just keep trying to push it a little too far. There's a thing called the en route decision tool, which is in the air medical world, and the Pilots Association of the Air Medical Association came up with an en route decision making tool. So it adds up. If you've had to slow down and go down, it's time to put the aircraft on the ground. Where do you make that decision? And these are things that we should be talking to ourselves about, when we're flying, when we're learning, when we're in every situation that we get in should teach us something about what we're going to do the next time. I hope that makes sense to everybody. The second part is know what to do in the emergency. And so knowing the book, knowing the physics, and knowing the best odds. Again, we go back to where we were talking about, the best thing to do if you're if you don't have a great place to do your auto rotation, know what the odds are. And the best circumstance there is to make sure that you keep your RPM and do a good auto rotation, even if it's to a bad area. So thinking about all of those things, that happens, you should be talking about that in what happens if the generator fails, what happens in the standard emergencies, you know, that typically could happen along your route. What are you going to do, and how are you going to handle that emergency? The last one is understanding aviation decision making, right? So really there's an exercise that we can do while we're flying, and that is, you know, what would happen if some emergency occurs right now? You know, you should always be questioning them. It's a good exercise. It's something you can talk to yourself about and try weigh all the options. In whether you're an offshore pilot or aeromedical, you know, how are you going to deal with a circumstance if it comes up right now, right? And so it's a self-teaching method, but thinking about it ahead of time may save your life later. Situational awareness is something that we should always be aware of, right? So that's a skill that we teach ourselves, to see what's going around us all the time. And that has everything to do with the weather. It has everything to do with other aircraft. You know, what are the environmental conditions that we might want to think about ahead of time? And then the last thing is, what is your decision point? You know, where are you going to make that decision to either turn around or go down and do a precautionary landing? You know, these are things that we can think about all the time, and it will, as the emergency gets more and more real, right? Your adrenaline kicks in, your heart rate goes up. This is really an awful time to be making decisions. As much as possible, you should have thought about it long before you ever got in the situation. And perhaps thinking about it ahead of time will keep you from getting in a bad spot. You know, we do these things and we talk about all this hangar talk, and we talk about situations that we've had, things that we've done. And we do that, you know, because in an accident, it's a really hard time to think clearly, right? So these are tools that we put in our own toolbox. And I hope that you do that and you learn to use them. And I hope you never have to. That would be great, right? But in a long career, you're going to come upon some of these things. And I'm hoping that you'll know what to do and how to do it because you've thought about it ahead. I want to tell one quick story. When I went down to the Gulf of Mexico, it was a startup company. Literally, a friend of mine called me up, and the owner of the company had bought 6 helicopters. So he hired 12 pilots, and I was one of those 12 pilots. My friend was interviewing, called me, and I literally flew down there the next day and interviewed for the spot. So there were only a couple of the 12 pilots who were experienced guys in the Gulf of Mexico, and so we were all learning. It was all new stuff, right? And somewhere along the way, there was some minor promotion, and it wasn't a big promotion, you know, but it was, you know, a promotion came up and I got it, right? And one of my peers, one of the guys I flew with, was visibly upset. We were at the staff meeting where they announced that I was now in charge of garbage cans or something, you know, but it was a promotion, right? And he was visibly upset, enough that I went and talked to him afterwards, right? And I said, you know, obviously this upsets you. I said, what's the problem? And he said, you know, everybody knows that you make mistakes. And then a promotion comes along and you get it. He says, I just don't understand that, right? And I looked at him, I said, because you don't own up to your mistakes, do you think the rest of us think you don't make them? Right? When I make a mistake, I assume that someone else could make the same mistake too. And yeah, you know, I might seem a little silly, but I want everybody to hear it, right? Because it might save them from making the same mistakes, right? You know, we live in a world where, you know, pilots especially, we've got egos, you know, let's face it, right? Every one of us believes we're the best pilot in the world, right? And that might be true, right? But the fact is, anytime you make a mistake or something funny happens, we should be talking to each other about it, right? Because it might help the other person make a better decision than you did when the time comes, right? This is the essence of doing good SMS, you know, safety management work, you know, when we're talking about the hazards and talking about what we're going to do in case of an accident. It makes all the difference in the world. And you might, with just by telling a story where you felt stupid, might help somebody else survive an incident that was otherwise unsurvivable. And that's what we have to do to help each other. And I'm going to leave it with that. And the end of this story is that, learn to tell good stories, right? That we live and learn from the stories of our peers and our friends, right? And we can do that to help each other. Thanks for listening. And I'm ready for questions. Thanks, Dave.
Oh, thanks, Dan. Man, you had me laughing there a few times. And I think one of the things that I came away with is, if I told my mother I was going to be a helicopter pilot, what are the scenarios that she would picture in her mind, and how do I plan for those? So, mother, spouse, whatever that might be, but somebody's going to come up with a worst case scenario that I never would have ever expected, and how do you plan for that? So.
Well, it was interesting, Dan, when I was, like I say, I was a high school to flight school helicopter pilot. I had never planned to be a pilot. I literally, Vietnam was a reality. If you were a poor kid like me, you weren't going to get into college in 1968. That's just the way it was. There were college deferments if you were in college. And so there was no such thing as scholarship money to go to school. So I was going to end up in Vietnam. A couple of friends and I were sitting around just before we were getting out of high school. And one of the guys said, "We're not going to get into college, are we?" I said, "No." He said, "Well, if we don't get into college, we're going to get drafted, aren't we?" I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Well, if we get drafted, we're going to Vietnam, right?" And I said, "Yeah." He says, "Well, when we go to Vietnam, did you want to walk or did you want to fly?" I said, "I'm too lazy to walk." He said, "Good, I made an appointment for tomorrow," right? 5 of us went down, 3 of us ended up being helicopter. So, and then I totaled 5 helicopters. Never actually got shot down, thank you. But I totaled 5 helicopters before I was 21. So I have some stories, and the fact is, you learn from those events, right? You learn that you're the one in charge. When you walk away, it's because you kept flying to the very end, and don't let the situation run you.
Well, I think that's something that Jim brought up during his introduction, Stan, is that you're willing to share your stories. And you alluded to that, talking about promotions or extra responsibilities, is the fact that you are willing to share. And I think you're right, there is a stigma attached to sharing what some people could see as a potential mistake. But if somebody can learn from it, there's always the value for something like that. So where would somebody looking for a mentor or just simply advice, where's a great place for them to head? Where should they look?
It's a hard one. Well, other than the fact that in our current circumstance with COVID, and we had to cancel Heli Expo. Heli Expo is a wonderful place to learn. The educational offerings that are there, and in the back of the room at every educational thing is there's a group of old salty guys, trying to one up each other with war stories and stuff, and it's a great place to hang out. There's always people willing to tell the stories. You just have to ask the questions. Finding mentors is tough, right? But we end up as we get older, it gets easier, and the statute of limitations runs out on all your mistakes. It gets easier to tell the stories after that.
Okay, I'm going to start with a question that actually came in for me, but it's related to all of our webinars. It's from Lance Fisher. With the cancellation of Heli Expo and the Rotor Safety Challenge, how come you can't get these seminars active for wings credit? Lance, we actually are working on that. Some of the webinars we've already had have been available for wings credit. We do keep track of the attendance on webinars. Because we had to cancel the Rotor Safety Challenge this year, we are actually looking to try to convert as many of our Rotor Safety Challenge courses to webinars, and those will be coming up. We will have more information on that fairly soon. We'll try to make that information available not only through the webinars, but through Rotor Daily and through some of our other social media channels, because we feel that the Rotor Safety Challenge courses kind of like this one right now, offer a significant amount of information for attendees, for young pilots or for old pilots, for everybody. We want to make sure that this information is available. Stan, I got a question from John for you. I didn't understand how you use the tail as a crumple zone. Does this mean that you're auto-rotating into the trees or rocks? You should try to go backwards at the end of the auto?
Yeah. Bring it to a hover and put it into the trees as if you're doing, a normal auto rotation, but exaggerate the flare. You can just leave the tail down. You never have to actually level it out, so that when you're pulling pitch, you come to a stop, get rid of the forward airspeed, and then just allow it to settle tail first. So, in the physics there, blades come off, when you hit the trees, pieces are going to start to depart. But if you're moving backwards, it'll shuck the tail rotor first, the tail boom crumples, and then you kind of, unfortunately, you just have to take the rest of it as it comes. You're not going to get to control too much after that, but still, you've gotten rid of as much of the moving parts as you can, and gotten rid of the energy that throws parts around and kills them.
Now, I think you alluded to it during the presentation. Obviously, this is a worst case scenario where the trees are the only option, the rocks are the only option. There's not a lot of flexibility in what you have capable. I think that we all would prefer to follow OEM standard instructions for the airframe and conduct a normal auto rotation into a smooth field if at all possible.
Yep. Dan, could I go back to the wings credit thing? By the way, if anybody's looking at my Helicopter Safety Alliance, we used to put on seminars, but it's been very difficult to do seminars, safety presentations specifically for small operations. But we're putting together the first one. We're getting back. We're going to do one online. That's going to be a national presentation. I think it comes up the 4th of April, and that'll have 6 wings credits attached to it. So we're trying to do a national level thing, and as much as we can, we'll certainly do it in conjunction with HAI also.
Okay. Let's see here. From Jay Heffernan. Welcome back, Jay. We know that you are a longtime viewer here too. Stan, what did you hear about the Midwest Safety Seminar that they had in Minneapolis before COVID?
Well, that's the one I'm alluding to. We do it pretty much every January up in the Midwest for Minneapolis. Minneapolis, they do a really broad spectrum. People from North and South Dakota, from Minneapolis, from all of the states in that Great Lakes area. And they do a very good cooperative venture. So we've gone up there every January. This year, we did do it last January, and then we had to stop doing seminars altogether. But that's the one we're putting together. Looks like it's going to be in the first week in April, and there's news to follow. So I believe that they got permission to do a nationwide SPANS notice on that one. So keep in mind. I hope you are able to join us.
Can you give us your thoughts on one of the most common causes of fatal accidents around the world? Pilots attempting to continue VFR flight into deteriorating flight conditions. Have you had any experience with that, and what did you learn that you can share with others?
Yeah, and that I alluded to that a little bit in the talk. One of the things, to me, the biggest thing is that you can practice ahead of time, right? You can get on a simulator. The thing that's going to save you in a double IMC experience is confidence. If you have confidence that you can get through it, I had somebody describe to me one time. They said, even if you were double IMC and flying through a control zone, the odds of actually hitting something else are very low. Mountains are an exception. You sort of have to keep your wits about you and know your local area and stuff. But the real trick is to climb and get up and establish, good, safe flight, right? And then declare the emergency and find a way back down. Controllers are willing to help you, able to help you. There's things to do, but we all have to. Number one, we have to know our local area. We have to have some situational awareness about where we are, and if you have to punch into clouds, continuing on is a series of bad decisions, God, and then you have to forget about that and deal with the situation that's before you right now. And so again, our egos can get us in a lot of trouble, and you're afraid to admit or declare the emergency because you don't want to admit to somebody that you made a bunch of dumb decisions that got you there. Wrong, you know, take it like a man, you know, call them up, declare the emergency, and get some help, right? And so again, it's you know, the fact that you've done bad decisions to get there doesn't mean a thing, right? You have to deal with the situation in front of you right now, right? And I just think it's I've thought about that times that I really should have done it and didn't. And I got to tell you that on at least one of those occasions, I was just lucky that I'm not good, right? So this is a thing that we think about ahead of time. I would rather be embarrassed than dead. And I would rather be embarrassed than kill the people in the back seat. Take it like a
Yeah, that
man.
makes sense. Question from Martin. If ice is building up, what do you do? Should you reduce power or should you speed up?
Well, first of all, there's two things that happen when you put ice on, right? And one bad thing that can happen afterwards, right? The first thing that happens is that the blades become less aerodynamic, right? And so you lose performance ability because the shape of the blades changes. The second thing that happens is that the weight of the helicopter increases, right? I can't stress out, and then the third thing that can happen that's really bad is that the blade, one of the blades shucks the ice and the other one doesn't, and suddenly you're totally imbalanced, you know, and the weight is asymmetrical. So the only thing I can tell you is that you'll see ice building. The first place you'll see it is in the corner of your windshield. You know, all of a sudden you get a little frosting down in the corner and stuff. Do not hesitate. Get that aircraft on the ground. There is no reason to continue. You know, it's because I got to tell you, when it happened to me, you know, I saw the ice and I went, oh, really? I guess it's gonna ice. And when it ices, it just went all at once, right? So the kind of thing that it might just be a little bit, it might, but you got to acknowledge that your aircraft is going to stop flying. So put it on the ground as fast as you can. I'm not kidding. I just put it down wherever you are, right? You know, find a nice place on the side of the highway, you know, but get it on the ground. This is not a good situation any day.
Well, I mean, we talk about one of the great benefits of a helicopter is being able to conduct an off-airport landing when you need to, and
Yep.
and I think that provides a perfect excuse to conduct an off-airport landing right then and there. I was not aware that the ice would form in the corner of the windscreen first, and so then I'm sure that's helpful too. From Brian, do you feel law enforcement aviation should hire civilian pilots or continue to use officers who have had no flying experience and are trained within the unit? Is safety compromised in your opinion? It seems a bit specific.
Listen, this is a loaded question, all right? And here's why. You know, in the early days, and you know, I've been around long enough that I consider myself part of early helicopter aviation. You know, we came back from Vietnam. Prior to the pilots coming home from Vietnam, helicopter aviation was stunted because there weren't enough pilots, right? And suddenly 7,000 of us came back and joined the workforce, right? And there just weren't any jobs. So we were fighting each other for the jobs, right? So here's the problem, right? In police work, there is, all right, so the two competing philosophies. Philosophy number one, we got plenty of highly qualified, high time helicopter pilots who are combat experienced and can handle themselves in an emergency and aren't afraid when bullets are present, right? And why not put them into police departments because you have a significant safety increase. You know, you start with people who know what they're doing and have things. The competing philosophy says that police work is different than other work, and that we need to take officers who understand what's going on the ground, that understand police work in general, that know the people they're working with, and it's better to train them to be pilots because better communication, better mission preparedness, those sorts of things. So they're two competing philosophies, and frankly, I would always err on the side of going with the experienced pilots. But if you have the proper training techniques and do it the right way, there's no significant difference in how you go about that. It's a tough question, and it's been done both ways. You know, unfortunately, back in the early days, and I was one of these folks just out of Vietnam, I myself and one other pilot started a police aviation unit. I did the air medical side, and he was a sworn officer, right? So, but he was both, right? He had been a sworn officer, but also a Vietnam experienced helicopter pilot. So we had the best of both worlds, all right? When we did the civilian missions, he taught me how to do police work. I taught him how, you know, it's an interesting compromise. But safety doesn't come from pilot qualifications. It comes from good training and knowing what your mission is and pre-plan. Everything I said today was about pre-planning and thinking things out ahead of time. And that can be done safely with low-time pilots. I got to tell you that the end of that is I probably had 400 hours total, which sounds like a low-time pilot. But I was a combat experienced guy. I flew General Westmoreland and 2 U.S. senators. And when I got 100 miles away from their aircraft, I told them I was the oldest guy in the crew and I wasn't 21.
You brought up training, and of course, another element of safety is culture. You know, the safety culture surrounding an operation. Have you ever had to walk away from a job due to a poor safety culture? Or if you have not, what advice would you give to others who have to deal with that in their job?
No, this happened to me, and it was a turning point in my career. I was flying in the Gulf of Mexico, and I had been there for 8 years, and my company went out of business, right? But the oil company that I flew for told me that they would make sure I had a job with whoever took the contract over, right? And so they negotiated and they brought this company in, and so they were starting up. I mean, they literally they purchased a building that was 200 yards away from my house. It was the best deal ever, right? They made a little hangar out of an industrial building, and I could walk to work, right? And then they sent an aircraft up there, and I was flying it, and they sent the second aircraft, and when I pre-flighted it, the tail boom was capable of touching, the tail rotor was capable of touching the tail boom, which I thought was a bad thing, right? And I called up the owner of the company, said, okay, well, we'll get somebody up there to fix that, but in the meantime, just be real careful when you start it. And he said, because once it's spinning for you, it'll never touch it. And I'm going, this thing's installed wrong, and my job is to be real careful when I start it up. And I literally, in the space of 2 minutes, I said, well, you know, I like the people I fly for, so I'm going to keep working for them in that other aircraft. And this is 2 weeks notice. I gave them 2 weeks notice on the spot, right? And it changed my life. You know, you have to be able to walk away, right? And that answer was not sufficient for me, right? But it made me understand that, you know, everybody has different motivations for what they do. And sometimes when the motivation is we got to make money and we're not going to listen to safety stuff, it's your decision, it's your life. You know, you got to decide what you're going to do. I got to tell you something. If that ship was offshore and broken and they needed somebody to fly it home, I would have gone to get it, right? And I would have been real careful when I started it up. But just to make a statement that says, oh yeah, be careful until we can fix it, it's not okay, right? But we're all going to face that in our life. We're going to have a flight. The hard one is when one of your customers says, hey, can't we just try it? You know, it's hard to say no to customers sometimes. but you have to practice ahead of time and know that that's your real job, is to say no to and make it stick, you know, even when you don't want to do it.
Tony is asking for clarification. Stan mentioned 3 things of prevention. 1, recognize when an emergency. 2, what to do. And what was the third one?
I forget.
Well, that's why we have this on.
You know,
Tony, that's why we have this. Go ahead, Stan. Sorry.
No, it's you know, that's why we have slides. You know, I'm an old guy, but you know, it's you know, the bottom line is that we need to understand when we're in an emergency. That's the first one. It's hard to know. You know, sometimes you just think, oh shit, things are going wrong, right? Well, that's true, but you know, things are going wrong, and it's going to add up to a bad outcome. And recognizing that is hard. The second one is to know what to do, and the third one was you know the books and know what you're going to do and have a plan ahead of time.
Okay, sounds good. From Peter, is there anything a passenger can do to help in an emergency?
Interesting. Usually the passengers, you have to learn to ignore them because you know they have no experience. You know, the only thing that you can do is try to keep them calm. You know, because most of the things that passengers are able to do are distractions. You know, and you need to be very clear about your sterile cockpit environment, and you know, you have to be doing stuff, and sometimes you just have to not worry about them. The exception to that is passengers who are routine, right? So the offshore oil guys are a really good example, right? They if you're flying with the same people on a regular basis, there's things you can teach them, you know, and frankly, any help is good help, you know, as long as long as it's competent. If you're going to teach them right, and teach them what they can and cannot do during an emergency. Air medical crews can tune radios, can help out. You know, there's a variety of things. But on a standard passenger on a one-time ride, mostly what you're going to have to do is ignore them while they're screaming to each other.
This seems a little incomplete to me, and so, but maybe it makes more sense, but I'm not a pilot, obviously. In hover auto, in an American helicopter, if I was hovering to the right while nose to the front, what is the best I can do? And so I'm not certain I understand exactly what they're asking, but perhaps you have a better idea.
Sure. If you're in sideways hover, my contention is that the one thing that you can do, hovering out of rotations, they're over so fast that you mostly just pull up on the collective and try and keep it from bouncing too high, right? But the one thing that you can do and keep in your head is that anytime you're in a hovering on rotation, you stomp on the pedal and make sure that the nose is pointed in the direction you're moving, right? Because the helicopter doesn't care. And of course, it's going to have forces because the engine stops and it's going to want to turn one way or the other. But the thing, that one piece of control that you're going to have is the pedals, right? And the object is, before it touches the ground, have the nose pointed in the direction you're moving so that it doesn't hit on a skid and trip sideways and roll
over. And this is from George, in an IIMC situation, what is better to concentrate on, nose attitude or airspeed?
Control of the aircraft, right? You know, the thing about it is, if you're going 30 knots when you punch in, 30 knots is a bit slow to maintain flight, but don't make any big changes until you are in control of the aircraft, right? So it's almost always the right thing to do to add some power, except that, you know, you add power, you got to change the pedal settings, you got to change attitude. So if you're in controlled flight and you punch in and suddenly you just can't see, maintain what you got. You know, they they say that specifically in bigger helicopters, they say whenever an emergency comes up, Jay Heffernan taught me this. It says the first thing to do is always to wind your watch. young guys don't know what that means, but the thing is that don't do anything wrong, right? So as much as possible, you want to maintain control of that aircraft. So don't change a bunch of stuff right off. So if you're in controlled flight when you punch into the clouds, stay at that. Either you certainly want to climb, but the very first thing is control, and then make gradual changes. Don't change 5 things at once, right? If you've got a lot of airspeed, bring the nose up just a little bit so that you're in a climb attitude, right? If you're underpowered and the power's out, add collector. One thing, right? And maintain control at all times. And when you feel you've got control of that, then you make another change, right? One thing at a time.
It's just after 5 o'clock. We'll take just a few more questions and then get things wrapped up today. This you might be able to answer this because you're working the Gulf, but this is from Gabriel. Are there any special recommendations or teachings when flying above water on inter-island transfers? And so I was thinking about, going out to a platform or between platforms might be the same type of thing.
It's an interesting subject because flying over water is fascinating. First of all, just in I had a friend who made up sayings for everything when I was in the Gulf, and he said, when Vermilion Bay is smooth as glass, vertigo will get your ass, and things like when Vermilion Bay turns to brown, what looks like up might be down. There is flying over water is different, right? It's different, sometimes the obscured horizon. I got to tell you a quick story. One day, it was 7 miles of visibility, but it was a hazy day, and it was exactly that. The watercolor and the sky color were the same. And I was looking out at a rig that was out in the distance, so there's a fixed point. I'm flying towards it. And I looked down and I'm in a 15-degree right-hand turn. And I looked up and I'm flying for the same thing. I trim it up, I get it going straight. And I look and I'm looking at that rig and I'm flying. I look down and in a 15-degree right-hand turn. What turned out that thing that I thought was a fixed rig was another helicopter flying across my path 7 miles away. And I thought it was a fixed object. It spun my gyro. I had vertigo the rest of the day. I literally came back and said, I can't fly anymore today. Somebody else had to take my flight, because I got a headache, So there's things that you have to learn about flying over the water, and inter-island is the same thing. And one that is just my favorite thing that changed my life also was I had a flight one day, and again, it was a startup company. It was new, and so I was flying out to the farthest rig out. It was like there was a new rig. They moved in a drilling rig out to this platform, and I was flying at the limits of my fuel, right? I had enough fuel to get out there and get back, and that was it, right? And I flew out there and I'm navigating and trying to, maintain a course and all this. And I get out there, and as I get out, there's 2 rigs that are probably 30 miles apart. And one of them is 15 degrees to my right, and one of them is 15 degrees to my left. And I'm sitting there and I had to admit that I had to guess which one was the rig I was going to. And if I guessed wrong, I was going to have to fly an hour and a half back to get the fuel to go to the other one. All right, I didn't have enough fuel to go to both of them. All right, and I was lucky. I picked the right one, lucky. But the fascinating thing, I got back and there was a guy who'd been flying in the Gulf forever, Dick Sportsman, and looked at me and he said, "You're probably doing that dead reckoning stuff, right?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "You only have 2 accurate instruments in your helicopter, the whiskey compass and the clock." And he said, when you know that the heading to this platform is, 240 degrees, fly the heading. Don't correct for the wind. And when you fly out the time, turn into the wind. You'll hit your destination every time. And you know which way to turn at the end of the flight, right? So don't think about it ahead of time. Just fly out the distance and turn into the wind. And it's a lot simpler, and it always gets to your destination. Tricks that you learn out over the water because there's nothing else to work with.
Hey, real quick question from Peter, who is a German student pilot here in the U.S., have you ever written anything about your experiences or your done training, material?
I've threatened to write the book. It's called 101 War Stories and Other Lies I've Told.
We do have somebody who might be a neighbor of yours named Robert Nicholson. He's wanting to know what little town you're from in Philadelphia, or near Philadelphia.
Well, I'm 4 miles from the Willow Grove exit on the Turnpike in Bryn Athyn, Pennsylvania, which is
Okay.
actually the home of the Pitcairn Auto Gyro. I grew up with auto gyros in my backyard.
Let's do a closeout question here, Stan. What is the single most important message you want our viewers to take away from this webinar today?
Thinking on your feet. We get paid as helicopter pilots. Number one, we think that our job is to know all the rules and know how to do the emergency procedures and all that. But what we really get paid for is decision making, right? And decision making is a skill. It's perishable. You have to learn to make decisions, and you have to hone that skill all the time. And making those decisions, it's hard, right? We can physically, you can train a monkey to fly the helicopter, right? But you can't train them to make those decisions and to think ahead, and it's like I say, it's a hard thing to learn, especially when you've got people who want you to fly, or they only make money if you fly, or a passenger that has to get somewhere. The bottom line is you are the defense against other people's bad decisions. And you have to be able to make those decisions and be comfortable in the solution, right? And so there's times, and really in the beginning, I was a startup guy in air medicine. I started a bunch of different air medical programs. And the hardest thing of all is the first time that you're sitting on the pad and you've made a decision not to go, when it's a kid who needs the flight and it's the same age as your kid. Guess how hard that decision is to make, right? But you have to be comfortable in doing that. They were taking ambulances long before we had helicopters doing it. And there's still times when it's better for everybody involved not to take the risk, right? If somebody has to take the vaccine over the mountain to the village that's all going to die, we're all capable of doing it, right? And we might get away with it, right? You shouldn't be doing it on a regular basis, right? And so we have to learn to make decisions and learn to stick by them. It's really hard.
No, I like that, Stan. And I think the other thing you gave me an idea for today is something we've mulled over a little bit in planning our webinars. I didn't have a name for it now, but I think I'm going to call it the old guys in the back of the room. And maybe we'll do a webinar just for guys who can give advice on different scenarios.
Well, all those guys in the back of the room want to tell their stories. Ask them. Fear helps.
That's great advice. And there's always a break between seminars during Heli Expo, and so find those guys, follow them out the room, buy them a cup of coffee, maybe a beer later in the afternoon, something like that, and bend an ear, see what you can learn.
The other thing you might think about is, why don't you set up a classroom that's just an open platform for guys to tell their stories and record them?
I think that'd be fascinating. I really like that idea, and I think we could do a lot with that, especially with social media too. Stan, I invite you to turn your camera off. I appreciate your time today. As always, I think we'll have to have you back on eventually soon. I see that we do have questions that we just didn't get to today. So thank you so much. We do appreciate it.
I hope it was worthwhile.
It was worthwhile, Stan. I have a couple of housekeeping issues to get to today, as always. For more information, something we want to start talking more about, sources of information that HAI provides to our viewers. Subscribe to Rotor Magazine. Rotor Magazine is a quarterly publication that is just filled with all sorts of great stories, from features to advice columns, rotor pathways to talk about how people got into flying. It's a free magazine. It's even free for publication, or free for mailing here in the US. If you do live outside the United States, the shipping cost is only for the international addresses. It's not all that much. We also have digital copies online. If you want to subscribe, go to rotor.org/subscribe. and you'll find all the information there you'll need. Coming up next, we have Save the Date for HI at Work. February 4th, we have Crystal McGuire and Fred Dine, and they'll be talking on the ATEC Part 147 update. The legislation that passed late last year will affect airman certificates, and so this will be coming up next week. We're going to jump ahead a little bit. February 18th, we want to remind people we will have a Mill to Civ workshop for those people who are getting out of the military. We do encourage you to join us. If you're even thinking about it, if you're years away and you still want some advice on what to plan for, we encourage you to come in. That'll be at 5 p.m. Eastern. That's why we want to bring this one up. It's a little out of our normal time slot. 1700, of course, for you military folks. Please join us or watch the recording afterwards. We will have a questionnaire that will be coming to you shortly via email. We would appreciate to take you if you take the time to respond. We do look at each one of those, and we want to find out what you'd like to learn. If there are topics that we've not covered, if there were things about today's webinar that you enjoyed or didn't enjoy, what we could do better with future webinars. If there are things that HAI can do for you, we'd like to know about that as well. Please send us an email at rotor.org with your challenges, your questions, your comments, your praise if you have any. Jim does see each one of those, and he does handle, distribute those among the staff for action. Finally, until next week, we ask that you be safe, that you fly safe, and we will see you next Thursday.